Well, I want to thank the Peterson Institute and Fred, you in particular, Jeff Schott, and others who helped put this together. For many of us, the Peterson Institute has been a vital resource for over 3 decades here in Washington. This is certainly a place that I have relied on over and over again, and I want to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to meet with you today to explain what we're seeing out there on the front lines of hunger. Today, we come together to address one of the most pressing global issues of our time, the impact of soaring prices on the world's most vulnerable and the hungry. On March 3rd, rice cost $460 a metric ton. Today, just 5 weeks later, just 5 weeks after that, prices reached $780 a metric ton, and a few weeks thereafter, record levels at $1,000 a metric ton. Other commodities have doubled or tripled in price over the past year. Consumers are getting hit worldwide. For some, it is a painful pinch. For those living on less than 50 cents a day, it is a catastrophe. Of course, we are all consumers when it comes to food. Food is so basic to human survival that its denial is a denial of life itself. Some say there are only 7 meals between civilization and anarchy. At the 7th meal lost, order begins to fall apart as people are reduced to fending for survival. Ensuring access to adequate, affordable food and nutrition is certainly one of the fundamental roles of government and indeed of civilization itself. Today, the global food supply system is groaning under the strain of skyrocketing demand, soaring cost of inputs, depleted stocks, crop loss due to drought, floods, and severe weather. Last June, I warned we were facing a perfect storm for the world's most vulnerable. Today, I believe we are in the eye of that storm. News reports and images of deadly riots in Haiti, triggering the collapse of the government, and elsewhere throughout the globe are stark reminders that food insecurity threatens not only the hungry, but peace and stability itself. This is a very smart, august audience, so I'm going to conduct a pop quiz. And I'm going to quote someone and see if anyone in the audience can identify the source. Fred, you're not allowed to jump in, because he'll know, I think, right away. Quote, "The threat of famine, the fact of hunger, have haunted men and nations throughout history. This eternal problem has now taken on unprecedented scale and urgency, and can only be dealt with by concerted worldwide action. Our challenge goes far deeper than one area of human endeavor. We are faced not just with the problem of food, but with the accelerating momentum of our interdependence. In the past 30 years, the world came to assume that a stable economic system and spreading prosperity would continue indefinitely. Now there are fundamental questions about our capacity to meet even our most basic need. Partly due to bad weather around the globe, world grain production declined for the first time in more than 2 decades. We are made ominously conscious of the thin edge between hope and hunger, and the world's dependence on the surplus production of a few nations." I'm going to continue for a moment because you'll see why. "The contemporary agenda of energy, food, and inflation exceeds the capacity of any single government, or even a few governments together, to resolve. All nations are linked to a single economic system. Preoccupation with narrow advantage is foredoomed. The poorest and weakest nations will suffer most. Discontent and instabilities will be magnified in all countries. New dangers will be posed to recent progress in reducing international tensions. This need not be our future. There is great opportunity as well as grave danger in the current crisis. We must begin here with the challenge of food. No social system, ideology, or principle of justice can tolerate a world in which the spiritual and physical potential of hundreds of millions is stunted from elemental hunger or inadequate nutrition. National pride or regional suspicions lose any moral or practical justification if they prevent us from overcoming this scourge. In short, we are convinced the world faces a challenge, new in its severity, its pervasiveness, and its global dimension. Let us agree the scale and severity of the task require collaborative action, unprecedented in history. And let us make global cooperation in food a model for our response to the other challenges of an interdependent world: energy, inflation, population, and protection of our environment. We have no. Okay. The person who gave that speech, according to Time magazine, felt this keynote address was one of the most important speeches of his career. They were spoken almost 35 years ago by Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to the United Nations World Food Congress on November 5th, 1974. As you've heard, there are stark similarities between the global food crisis of the early 70s and the food challenge we face today. And we are beginning to see a robust global response to the current challenge. The Secretary General of the United Nations has formed a global task force to map out a forward strategy from emergency to long-term solutions. The President of the World Bank has called for a new deal on global food policy and has activated the bank to partner with governments and institutions across the globe on urgent responses and solutions. The Managing Director of the IMF has pledged to assist nations on financing for imports and balance of payment challenges. The world will gather June 3rd through 5th for an urgent food security summit in Rome, Italy, at the FAO to discuss these urgent challenges. The World Food Program is enormously grateful for the quick response to our extraordinary emergency appeal. Today, I'll hold up a cup. Some of you have met my red cup. This is from our school feeding program in Rwanda. Today, we can fill this cup 40% less than we could last June with the same contribution, just due to the higher food costs. So we put out an extraordinary appeal for $755 million, and we're about 60% of the way there. We are enormously grateful to the United States for the release of $200 million from the Emerson Trust and the President's announcement last week of a requested $1 billion in new emergency and developmental food and agriculture aid for 2009. This continues America's noble tradition of being a global leader in the fight against hunger. And members of Congress are even today pushing hard for an emergency supplemental for 2008 to help with the challenge. Other nations have stepped up to the plate, including Canada announcing last week an additional $50 million and a total untying of all their contributions, providing WFP with cash to purchase from poor farmers throughout the world. And progress has indeed been made since the time of the Kissinger speech. The world today is nurturing more people than ever before, and we have cut the proportion of hungry in half, from about 37% in 1969 to 17% last year. With advances in seed, fertilizer, and production technologies led by champions like Norman Borlaug, we have doubled yields of crops for the past 3 generations. But we are not keeping apace with demand. The absolute number of hungry people, defined as those unable to meet their basic caloric and nutritional requirements for human health, have continued to grow to 860 million people, with an estimated 4 million people added every year. WHO calls hunger and undernutrition the #1 threat to public health, killing more people than HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. Every 10 days, the world loses 250,000 people to hunger-related deaths, the equivalent of the casualties of the Asian tsunami. The vast majority of those casualties, 160,000, will be children. Now the World Bank estimates that an additional 100 million people will be thrust into deeper poverty and hunger due to the soaring food prices. The Director General of the Asian Development Bank said yesterday that 1 billion people in Asia are seriously affected by the surging cost of daily staples. I have traveled in recent months to Ethiopia, Kenya, Senegal, Mali, Egypt, and Syria, and talked with farmers and consumers. They express confusion and frustration as to what is robbing them of milk for their children, their weekly portion of meat, or for those who make less than 50 cents a day, reducing them to a single bowl of grain or one piece of bread. With little awareness of the macroeconomic forces at play, many blame their own leaders or local suppliers, millers, traders, and anyone else, threatening confidence in fragile democracies and markets. The world's misery index is soaring as food and fuel prices soar, rolling through the lives of the most vulnerable, a silent tsunami that respects no borders. Most do not know what has hit them. The issue here is resiliency, and for those living on less than 50 cents a day, there is no place to retreat. This is the new face of hunger, with people who were not in the urgent category just months ago joining ranks of desperation. Many nations are also exhausting their own coping strategies, with grain reserve reaching record lows, foreign currency reserves to purchase costly food imports depleted, and mitigation strategies such as removing import taxes on food already accounted for. Joachim von Braun, the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute, warns that, quote, the world food system is in trouble, and the hot spots of food risks will be where high food prices combine with shocks from weather or political crises. These are recipes for disaster. Perhaps the most fundamental question will be, is this challenge fundamentally different than the crisis of the early 1970s, which was quickly followed by another era of cheap and abundant food and oil? Or are we witnessing a structural shift in global agricultural markets, a new era of rapid and persistent growing demand for food, crashing against resource limitations in fossil fuels, land, and water, coupled with climatic changes that introduce unprecedented levels of uncertainty into annual agricultural yields? These are the questions we must urgently ask, because they must inform an urgent global response. The answers and the actions will determine whether together we enter an era of opportunity and hope, or a world of scarcity, where less resilient nations and individuals fend for themselves, with the world's bottom billion losing out once again. Let's quickly explore three subjects: the revolution in food aid, the new face of hunger, and a global call to action. The World Food Program is the world's urgent hunger institution. You turn to us when all else fails to prevent life-threatening food and nutrition vulnerability. We have been undergoing a transformation in the way we do business. This is not your grandmother's food aid. WFP is the world's largest humanitarian organization and charged with the responsibility to meet hunger when all other systems collapse. Today, we manage a global lifeline that can reach any corner of the world in 48 hours, as we did after the war in Lebanon and will today in Myanmar following the devastating cyclones there. WFP uses thousands of planes, ships, helicopters, barges, and if needed, donkeys, camels, and elephants. We deliver not only food, but an array of life-saving goods for dozens of partners, including medicines for WHO. Our humanitarian air service brings 400,000 humanitarian and developmental workers in and out of disaster zones each year, including 10,000 in and out of Darfur each month. Today, we reach up to 90 million people a year threatened with starvation and acute malnutrition. We are also among the most efficient in the world, using only 7% of our budget on overhead. We have state-of-the-art controls on food distribution from purchase to consumption. We are 100% voluntarily funded, receiving no assessed funds from any source. When we were founded back in the 1960s, WFP literally was a surplus food program, with nations of the world sharing their bounty with the world's hungry. This saved many millions of lives, but could also be a rather blunt instrument, leading at times to a mismatch between populations and food products, and could lead to disruptions in local agricultural markets. Today, less than 2% of our food is surplus donation. And today, up to 55% of our budget is cash, allowing us to purchase food from farmers throughout the developing world. Today, 80% of WFP's cash for food is used to procure food in the developing world. This year, this will infuse around $1 billion into poor farming communities. WFP has evolved, and in June I will present to our board a new strategic plan marking a historic transition from what I call a food aid agency to a food assistance agency. What I mean by that is looking at how we can use food and food assistance to not only meet critical emergency needs, but, whenever possible, to work in concert with fragile local markets and agricultural production to help ensure urgent hunger interventions help strengthen local food security on a more lasting basis. To that end, we have, and these are highlighted there, upgraded our needs assessment and vulnerability analysis, which we conduct for the global system, to include local market conditions. Thanks to a 3-year project just completed, we can now assess down to the household level what is causing hunger vulnerability. Is it, for example, crop failure, or that food in the markets is just too expensive? Obviously, that would inform our response. Secondly, we seek to ensure our hunger responses support local farmers and markets wherever possible. For example, during the recent floods in Mozambique, food could not reach the victims and they could not afford to buy it, but there was plenty of food on local markets. In that case, 80% of the food for the victims we purchased from Mozambican farmers, creating a win-win situation. Third, to that end, we are asking our board to approve a broader toolbox of responses to hunger that can be more nuanced in protecting local markets while addressing urgent hunger and nutrition needs. These responses range from bringing in commodities when necessary, such as in Darfur, where 70% of the more than 3 million people we feed every day are fed with American commodity aid, and there is not enough extra food on local markets to purchase. 2, local purchase, where often there is no food on the shelves, but there is food trapped on farms, but no infrastructure to get it out. And WFP can go and get it, as we do in DRC, where we tripled our local purchases this year in the middle of a major conflict. Also, one tool we're looking at is targeted food vouchers or cash, as we did in Indonesia after the economic troubles there in the 1990s, and may be appropriate in response to the current challenge. To food for work and assets, to local capacity building and food security systems and infrastructure. We have introduced what I call my 80-80-80 solution. Today, 80% of WFP's cash for not only food, but land transport is spent locally, and 80% of WFP's staff is hired locally. This helps build permanent local capacity and knowledge of food security. I am adding another 80 to my 80 solution, because also more than 80% of our activities take place outside of our headquarters in Rome or outside of the major cities in partner countries. We are deep into the rural economies, helping improve desperately needed local infrastructure. Which leads to the final bullet, 5 there, that we seek whenever possible that food is transformed into a productive investment into these economies. To that end, in exchange for life-saving food, WFP has trained local populations, and over the past 4 decades, for example, we have planted over 5 billion trees in the developing world, helping stabilize ground soil, have demined and built tens of thousands of kilometers of vital feeder roads, including in the past few years opening more than 10,000 kilometers of roads in DRC, Angola, and southern Sudan. Last year, in fact, the government of southern Sudan became one of my top 10 donors, as WFP partnered with them in reopening roads for farmers, building schools and hospitals, allowing us to reduce dependency and cut general food distribution in half. In all our work, we look for what I call the value chain of hunger, to ensure our interventions are coherent with the work of the government, our partners, our #1 partner, and also our UN partners such as UNICEF, WHO, FAO, UNDP, and our vital NGO partners such as CARE, World Vision, Oxfam, Caritas, Red Cross, and Red Crescent Movement. On local purchase, which you can't see, but I think we have charts to distribute. As I said, we are spending now over $600 million in the developing world. I'll give you just one example in Senegal. President Wade has called for action on goiter, a huge challenge for Senegal, where virtually none of the salt for local consumption is iodized. They have big salt-producing companies that do iodize, but it all gets exported. To support the president's call to action, WFP decided that we would purchase our salt for our programs in Senegal from 7,000 village salt producers, and partnering with the Micronutrient Initiative, we helped the villagers purchase the equipment and receive training in the technology to iodize salt. Today, 7,000 salt producers, most of them women, have a steady income, and they provide 100% of the salt needs for our Senegal program. In fact, they now produce iodized salt for the local markets, which is helping address what the president called one of their biggest health challenges. This is a win-win situation. The salt ladies of Senegal are so good that we are now able to buy some of their salt for our regional program. There are many such examples. Last year at our school feeding program in Ghana, 100% of the food was purchased locally. This can help break hunger at its root. Okay, well, that came up, okay? These are just the top 20 purchase markets last year. The perfect storm. Let me talk about the challenges we face, the action we feel is needed to address this new challenge. Soon after joining WFP, as I said, I looked at our portfolio of work and became very concerned about the trends. The world was producing more than it consumed. Stocks were being drawn down, and the stock-to-use ratio was at all-time lows. But when did this tip into the crisis mode for the most vulnerable? While things were already difficult, I would point to last June as the launch pad for a period of aggressive and relentless price increases that have left the poorest nations and WFP itself reeling. Between June of last year, as I mentioned, when we priced our program of work, in February of this year, our cost drivers of food and fuel had increased 55%. This pattern of aggressive increase has continued for most commodities, with the exception of wheat, which has dipped down a bit recently. Globally, we have seen the price of rice rise dramatically. So we can go to the next slide. This just shows that aggressive increase, even in the past 20 weeks. And we'll just go quickly through these. The same pattern with maize. Wheat has been the same with a recent dip, but still priced much higher than June '07. And sorghum prices have also skyrocketed. The audience knows well the confluence of factors cited for the increases: rising demand in China and elsewhere, record prices of oil, which raises the price of food production from fertilizer to delivery, to the fusing of food and fuel markets, accelerated by record high oil prices, with severe weather throwing in additional supply shocks. These factors have created a supply and demand challenge that may take some years to sort out. Food supply is relatively inflexible and vulnerable to unpredictable factors, such as weather. 300,000 hectares of rice production were lost overnight in Bangladesh when the cyclone hit last fall, and the storm in Myanmar has hit the rice bowl just during harvest. According to USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance, the total number of disasters worldwide on average is now 400 to 500 a year, up from an average of 125 in the 1980s. And there have been what I call follow-on factors, nations shifting from shutting down export markets, further tightening global supplies. In addition, there is hoarding and market speculation adding and as contributing factors now. This is creating perhaps the first globalized humanitarian emergency. It has been said that a hungry man is an angry man, and food riots and protests have broken out throughout the world, triggered by a new phase of hunger in urban areas, which have attracted the majority of the world's population in search of opportunity. While it has been said that famines are incompatible with democracy, I will tell you that some of the world's gold standard new fledgling democracies are the nations under most pressure now. These nations, many of which are dependent on imports to feed up to half or more of their population, are reeling under this combined challenge. Nations are coping with food and inflation import challenges in different ways. Many have removed import tariffs, sacrificing revenues but alleviating price pressure. Today, it is estimated that more than 40 nations have imposed export controls on commodities, greatly restricting global markets. Today, WFP, which, as I mentioned, is a buyer in more than 80 nations, has humanitarian food trapped in nations that have banned exports. We face a major pipeline break in food supplies to Somalia, as 12,000 metric tons of food we purchase in Kenya is now blocked from export. This is happening in numerous places. Today, 1/3 of the globe's wheat suppliers have banned exports. Countries most at risk are developing nations that are import dependent and already experiencing an additional shock from conflict, floods, droughts, or storms. Think here Afghanistan, Somalia, Haiti, Burundi, Mauritania, and others. WFP has mapped countries on a scale of high vulnerability to low vulnerability. As you can see, by far the greatest vulnerability is in Africa. We have also mapped individual vulnerability. Most urgent to watch here are those whose health is already fragile or critical, the under 2-year-olds, pregnant and lactating mothers, HIV/AIDS patients, refugees, and IDPs who cannot meet their own food needs. The new face of hunger is also more urban than before. As the world's most vulnerable struggle on the thin edge of survival, we are seeing negative coping strategies in full force. For those on less than $2 a day, education and health are being sacrificed. Livestock is being sold off. For those living on less than $1 a day, milk, protein, fruits, and vegetables have become rarities, if at all. For those living on 50 cents a day, as I said, it is a catastrophe, with whole meals being lost or whole days without food, diets totally devoid of nutritional content. And we'll give 2 examples here. In Haiti, is experiencing really a compounding vulnerability, with coping strategies already having been greatly weakened. As many of you have read, mud cakes, originally used for medicinal purposes only, are now sold and consumed as a staple. Even those prices have shot up. In Burundi, the core staple for the poorest of the poor has become something called black flour. It's cassava that is moldy. It looks like blue cheese, but even the cost of that has gone up 3-fold. As Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has said, this crisis threatens the hard-earned development progress of many nations across a range of Millennium Development Goals. Here are our concerns at WFP. First, as I mentioned, in a time of increased need, we're able to reach fewer people than just even a few months ago. Due solely to the soaring food prices, we have 40% less food in the pipeline. For our programs, this is a direct impact. I was just in Kenya in the Kibera slums at a school where many of the children rely on WFP for their only cup of food a day. Some are now taking home half the cup of food for their younger siblings who don't have any. For these children, the vulnerability is profound. We're not talking about meat, potatoes, vegetables, and a little dessert that gets sacrificed in the hard times. It's the 1 cup of porridge, and as you've seen, we announced this week that we are having to cut 450,000 school lunches in Cambodia, and we have a number of other countries where we will have to be rolling out cutbacks. Second, as I've already mentioned, we have an emerging new face of hunger. We estimate an additional 130 million will be unable to meet their food needs due to the high food prices, adequately meet their food needs. Third, we are concerned about access to food supplies. For example, we tried to buy wheat this fall to make biscuits for the victims of the floods in DPRK, and for 10 days, for the first time in our memory, we could not buy it anywhere in the markets. In the past weeks, we have had commodity contracts broken. Between the time we made the contract and picking up the food 2 weeks later, prices had risen so quickly that the grain went to a higher bidder, the supplier willingly paying us the 5% performance bond to get out of the contract. We also have had food aid trapped in nations, as I mentioned. We are finding fewer and fewer markets open to procurement at all, with an estimated 40, as I've said, already under export controls. The fourth is connected to that. One would expect the natural reaction from farmers to high prices would be to plant more, and that is happening throughout the major agricultural economies. But in the developing world, there are indications that the reverse is happening in many places. I knew that poor farmers were not necessarily benefiting from the high prices, because half the hungry in Africa are farmers who cannot produce enough even for their own family. Most are so disconnected from markets that they cannot really benefit. But what I did not realize is what I saw in Kenya when I visited the Rift Valley. Fertilizer has gone from 1,700 shillings there in December to 4,000 shillings just 12 weeks later. The breadbasket of Kenya, farmers are planting 1/3 of what they planted a year ago. According to the International Herald Tribune, this is happening in other places such as Laos, and FAO and EFAO say this is happening throughout the developing world. These farmers are retreating to subsistence mode, withdrawing from markets until things stabilize. This could indicate serious shortages in upcoming harvests, further compounding our challenge. My fifth concern is that many of the policy reactions may actually be helping to feed the crisis, not people. It is understandable that nations will use whatever levers they have to alleviate pressure to help meet the needs of their people. Yet some of these may deepen the challenge. Today, many of the world's farmers are under price controls, further discouraging increased planting. Inputs rise, but food prices are under a ceiling. A range of major food exporters have put blocks on exports almost overnight, from China, Vietnam to Argentina to Kazakhstan. This global rash of beggar thy neighbor responses will not provide a solution. In addition, many nations who can afford to are stockpiling, further tightening supply and driving up prices. And lastly, I am concerned that as high prices persist, we are entering a second phase of this challenge, one that is threatening not only caloric intake but nutritional status and livelihoods. In our vulnerability mapping of household needs, we are finding that these coping strategies, such as selling off livestock and other possessions, shifting to cheaper foods, sacrificing health and education, are being depleted without any clear indication of relief in sight. What should be done? We must take this crisis as a global call to action, concerted action to support the governments and the people hit hardest and to help stabilize global supply and response. The Secretary General's task force was formed to help provide a coherent strategy of response. We're working closely, all of us, the World Food Program and others at the UN with the World Bank and the IMF. And the Secretary General has appointed coordinators, Sir John Holmes and David Nabarro, to help on this global action plan. Among the actions we see as urgent, we, the WFP. One, we do have to help governments alleviate immediate suffering and prevent a crippling outbreak of severe malnutrition. When there is no food to be had, we must keep the humanitarian pipeline full. We are working with partners such as UNICEF and WHO to scale up therapeutic feeding to reach children most at risk. We have the tools. We can reach children quickly and alleviate an acute humanitarian crisis. Secondly, we need humanitarian access to food. And today, I call on all nations to provide procurement access for humanitarian purchases. IFPRI's Joachim von Braun has urged also that the world consider humanitarian grain stockpiles that can be drawn down on systematically over the next few years as we adjust to this challenge. We urge a dialogue on this issue. Third, we must help nations ramp up safety nets, such as school feeding, and productive social safety nets, such as WFP partners with the government of Ethiopia. To this end, we urge Congress to urgently reconsider the substantial, predictable funding for the McGovern-Dole school feeding program that is in the current Farm Bill. Third, to ensure the next harvest, we need urgent action on agricultural inputs that have been priced out of the reach of poor farmers. FAO estimates that $1.7 billion is needed urgently. EFAD is deploying an action plan on fertilizers that will put an immediate $200 million in the reach of governments who want to act. Fourth, the African Union under NEPAD and the Comprehensive Agricultural Development Plan, CAADP, has called on all governments in Africa to invest 10% of their budget in agriculture. Nations that have, such as Ghana and Malawi, are beating the hunger curve. The average investment is now 4% throughout the continent. Shifting to 10% would put an additional $5 billion in resources on the table. Fifth, the World Bank has doubled its investment in agriculture in Africa and has activated globally to help. This is critical. And also the IMF actions announced in support of nations to help them deal with import financing challenges. And perhaps most critically, as FAO has called for, we must all join forces to boost agricultural production, especially in the developing world. The Gates and Rockefeller Foundations have formed the Alliance for Green Revolution, AGRA, under the leadership of Kofi Annan, and there are fantastic contributions of Norman Borlaug and others, Jeffrey Sachs, and many who are joining to boost production with the African Union and with governments throughout the world. These efforts can help ensure an era of plenty and stability for all. At the 1974 World Food Conference in Rome, Henry Kissinger set the bold objective that, quote, within a decade, no child go to bed hungry, no family will fear for the next day's bread, and no human being's future and capacities will be stunted by malnutrition. A number of countries have been on track to reach the Millennium Development Goal on hunger and will by 2015 if we stand with them. Ghana, Chile, Brazil, Malawi, Vietnam, and others. We must stay the course. Many countries are doing the right things. We must stand by their side. I am an optimist. My ancestors were from Ireland and left during the famine. And yet, just 2 generations later, we've left an economy of famine to one of prosperity. It can be done. Defeating hunger is achievable. It requires no new scientific breakthrough. We know how to do it, and I thank you all for joining me today for this urgent discussion.